everybody, it's Luke at Young Writers, and I'm here today with Piers Torday. How are you doing?
I'm really well. Lovely to be here.
Cool. So anyone out there that is watching and hasn't managed to read your wonderful books before, could you tell us a little bit about yourself in your own words?
So my name is Piers, as you said, and I write books for children, mainly aged sort of 8 to 12, I guess. And my first book was called The Last Wild, and it's an adventure about a boy called Kester who can't talk to people, but he discovers he can talk to animals. And this really matters because he lives in a world where a mysterious virus, I know we've all had enough of those, has killed nearly all the animals in the world. And he finds a few that have survived, called the last wild animals, and he has to try and save them. And that's what he does over 3 books of a series. And that kind of got me really into writing these fantasy adventures for young people. And I've written about 8 books. There's the Last Wild series, and there's the Lost Magician series, which is my kind of homage to the Narnia books, which I loved as a kid. Only you going through a magical library rather than a magical wardrobe. I've got There May Be a Castle, which is a kind of snowy, Christmassy adventure, because I remember as a kid curling up with snowy, Christmassy books. They were some of my favorite. And I've also written some plays. I adapted Box of Delights, the John Masefield children's classic that some people may remember the TV version of, and Christmas Carol. And I've written some short stories. And yeah, that is me, and that is what I do.
Cool. So, I mean, actually, as you mentioned, like going back to when you was younger, something that I find really interesting, and this is something that I also chatted to Catherine Woodfine about, but you took or have taken a very writing-oriented approach. You know, I've interviewed a few other authors who either like accidentally stumbled into it, always knew that they loved writing, and kind of, you know, found it as an accident. But I remember reading, you know, that you grew up in a bookshop, kind of like crawling around books, and kind of just began writing. And I think that's not a different approach, but one that not everyone takes. So do you want to kind of take us through that journey? Because there might be some other writers there watching, kind of understanding their own journeys.
Yeah, I was basically doomed from the start because I grew up in Northumberland, in the north of England, and my mum, when I was little, she ran a bookshop. She didn't know anyone. They just moved there to this town called Hexham, and so to meet people, she opened a bookshop, which she called Total Books after Total and Wind of the Willows. And so when I was a toddler, I was, you know, she would be in the bookshop and I'd be on the floor pulling all the big heavy books down off the shelves, and I don't know, trying to lick them probably rather than read them. And so I've kind of, and my mum said that she read books to me even when I was, you know, she was carrying me even before I was born. And so I've kind of always been surrounded by books. And both my dad and my mum loved reading stories to me when I was little, like, you know, the Narnia stories or the Hobbit or things like that. And they also read comics to us and all sorts of things. And so I think books were in my life from the start, and it seemed like a sort of a good thing to want to do. But that also creates its own pressure in a way, because you're so aware of how many brilliant books there are. It can make you a bit self-conscious. But I also think it was inevitable that having just been exposed to so many words and pictures at a young age, that I did start writing and making up my own quite early on. And I lived in the middle of the countryside, and, you know, pre the internet, there wasn't always a huge, you know, it was quite, and, you know, TV, certainly for kids, didn't start till quite late in the day. So tea time after school was only on for about 10 minutes. And so I kind of started making up little stories, just partly because I was bored a lot of the time, to be honest, and made little comics. I made a comic about a hero called Super Sid, who lives in a village full of superheroes, and his superpower is that he doesn't have a superpower. And putting that into a local newspaper. And I think I just began to enjoy, I was encouraged to share stories at school by a very enlightened primary school teacher. And I think I got a lot of pleasure when people enjoyed a story or made them laugh. And so that was kind of the beginning. But it took me a really long time from that like childhood interest to find my path as a professional writer. I did loads of I did lots of drama at university. So I ended up working in theatre at the Edinburgh Festival after university. And then I found my sort of migrated from theatre to telly, and I worked in TV for time and come up with ideas and producing things. But it wasn't until my mid 30s that I really, and I all that time at university and afterwards in my 20s, I tried to write books, and it was all terrible, and I didn't have any confidence, and I didn't know what I was trying to say. And then it wasn't until my mid 30s that I just suddenly, I don't know, it just kind of clicked,
Mm.
and I took myself off on a writing course and began to kind of write properly.
Mm.
Um, so it's never too late, but it does, as you say, it absolutely goes back
Yeah.
to that childhood discovery of books.
But I think that's actually quite nice, because you sort of have like the best of both worlds. It's some people out there like live and breathe books, and they know it's where they want to go, they know it's what they want to do, and they kind of charge at it. And that was like, to some extent, you went, as you say, about the bookshop and writing comics when you was younger, but also you didn't fall into it until you just said your mid-30s. So it kind of in a way marries both together, and it's always quite nice to show writers out there or whatnot that oftentimes it will happen if it's meant to happen, or it doesn't have to happen right now. I think there's a lot of pressure on children in school to kind of at 16, like, what do you want to do, go do it, work towards it or whatever, and that's not always the case. And when you look at a lot of writers, authors, musicians, whatever, it didn't always happen that way, and it's just really interesting to get the stories of all these people.
Yeah, it takes, and I think the thing with writing is that it's a very, certainly writing fiction, writing a book, it's so personal, and you're really often trying to, sum up a lifetime's kind of experience and memories and your feelings about things. And it just takes, I think people underestimate, it just takes a long time to work out how to do that. And I think the thing I discovered was that um, it's about coming to the page, if you like, each day. So sit down and just try and write something, even if you're not sure where it's going or if it's any good. Because the more you do that, the more confidence you will start to have in your own voice and your own abilities. Um, and you kind of also realize that, so I've realized the more books I write, it's the first time you write anything, it's always rubbish. It's always terrible. Like it never, to get something into kind of book form just takes so many drafts and edits um, but and that's much easier when you're published and having an editor saying, right, where's the book, and an agent saying you need to do it by this date, because that kind of forces you to do it.
Yeah.
Starting out, when you don't have an agent or a publisher, you have to really kind of force yourself and draw on big reserves of confidence to do it,
Mm.
because you do need to encourage yourself constantly, because it won't happen by itself.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that kind of is mirrored by most people, or everyone that I've spoken to at least, is that it's never, or not never, but it's not always good. I think a lot of people, and the way it's possibly portrayed in films, TV, or whatever, is you'll kind of sit down and bash out a book and it's done and it's great, and then it's on the shelves like the next day, and you write it within 12 hours and it's amazing, and it never happens like that. And we spoke to like Cressida Cowell, and she said like some of her top advice would be just to write. If it's rubbish, it doesn't matter, write, practice, love it, do it, and then you come back to it and you change it. And if something's really good, or something stands out, edit it and work on it. And that's something that I think a lot of people say. But moving on onto your book series, I was going to bring up the wonderful mirror between life and your books, with the raging virus that's taken over the world. So maybe it's breathing a new life, maybe it's coming back around. But there is, of course, as well, this large concept of environmentalism, the environment, and kind of putting that towards the younger generation. And I think that's something that's really important now more than ever. So do you want to maybe tell us a little bit more about the book series and the messages?
So as I said, I grew up in the countryside, and I was very lucky to grow up, out by the woods, and remember seeing a lot of wildlife growing up. Saw badgers and otters and woodpeckers and toads and things, and all sorts of animals. And it was kind of, as I got older, and then I moved to London. Obviously, I saw a little less wildlife.
Yeah.
But then I really began to notice that there was just generally less wildlife everywhere. And then came the news, I guess, the beginning of this decade that we're now very familiar with, but really that we are in this middle of this extinction event where, since before I was born, we've lost over 60% of the wildlife on this planet, and which in human terms is basically like losing everyone in Europe, America, Africa, and China. It's phenomenal. And so and that matters, I suppose, because we're all connected. We're all part of the same ecosystem, and eventually if the animals go, if the insects go, if the bees go, we'll be in real trouble. And so I really wanted to write for children about this because I know that children obviously respond well to animals. I think it's much harder to engage children about, temperature changes and ice things melting and, all these abstracts of climate change, which are just as important, but they're not. Whereas animals, I think children obviously love animals. I think often because they're vulnerable, they're small and no one listens to them. So I think it's quite easy for children to identify with the situation animals find themselves in. And I wanted to give animals a voice, 2.5 million other species that share this planet with us, and yet they have no say in the many decisions human beings make, which affect their habitat, their food, their quality of life, their lifespan. And so I really wrote the Last Wild books, where a boy who can't talk to people discovers he can talk to animals, and he gives animals a voice. And I use the idea of the virus to be a sort of allegory for climate change itself. And that was pre-COVID, but it was also post foot and mouth. The foot and mouth pandemic, which was, the first pandemic of this century, not on the scale of COVID for humans, but for animals, it was horrific. I'm sure everyone, I don't know if you can remember, or people can look up, but the sort of piles of burning animals, and the kind of effect that had on everyone's life in the noughties. But I wrote 3 books on climate change for children: The Last Wild, The Dark Wild, and The Wild Beyond. And you've never said anything on climate change, but I felt I'd said quite enough. I should probably shut up about it for a bit. And then when Greta Thunberg appeared, I just found that so inspiring, because here was a young person who was just not afraid to speak truth to power, and she took on powerful people, and and she told them the way the world was, that it was on fire, and she said it so insistently that they had to listen. And she also inspired children, to go on strike and to go and protest, and I think she kicked the sort of climate change discussion into a new level, which is this new urgency, because we've gone from being a bit worried about climate change to like it's actually happening around us. The heat, COVID, of course, is a climate crisis as much as a public health one. So I went back and I decided to write a prequel to The Last Wild, which is The Wild Before. And the Last Wild books are quite dystopian because they're set in this world without animals. And so the good news is, or this is the sort of world before. This is really about why what we have is so precious, and why you should love it and look after it, but also about how to find hope and resilience when that world is under threat.
Yeah, I mean, it's just really important, as you said, Greta Thunberg really brought it into our attention and hopefully was a spearhead for the younger generation. And I think what's really important at the moment is that we are kind of bringing the next generation up with these ideas and, and these concepts, because ultimately they're the ones that are going to be coming into, the next stage and the next generation, and looking after the world, and it being their responsibility. And if we have people and books like these, they're going to come up with the right ideas and the right kind of education around the environment when they do come into charge. And books like this really help, and they put it into a way that can influence children. But also, as you say, I think one thing that we all love in a book and find is hope and inspiration. And they piece together this idea that you can make a difference, and we should love it, rather than just, here's a problem, what are we going to do? It's here's a problem, you can make the change, you can make the difference. And one thing that we always try and say is that anyone can make a difference, and anyone can make a change, and everyone has to. And that's something really important. And you said about children relating with animals, it's kind of also the opposite, because they are the ones who can make a difference, as everyone can. And it's just a really important message and an important book. So yeah, and so that's the fourth one, but it's the prequel. So if
confusingly,
no
yes,
picked them up before, then you go back to the original one, which was called, what was the first one called again?
The Last Wild.
The Last Wild. And then
the Last Wild is confusingly the first book, and the Wild before is confusingly
and this one's the Wild Before, which is the prequel.
Yeah.
However, I mean, a fascinating series, and important and inspiring and hopeful and positive, even if it is about a virus that impacts these animals. Ultimately it's positive, and it's in doing important work. So hopefully some people out there go and they pick them up and they kind of get inspired from them. But I have one final question, and it could be related to what we just talked about. It could be related to writing. It could be anything that you want. But if you could broadcast one message to every maybe child, younger generation, young writer, whatever it may be, what would that message be? That's quite a big one, but
that message would be that your ideas and your thoughts are valid, and they are unique, because every single human being is an individual. And whatever your idea is, you may think someone else has done it before, loads of other people are doing this, maybe, but they won't be doing it in the way you're doing it. And your take on something, your belief, your instinct that your idea is good is absolutely true. And I would just encourage everyone to hold on to that. If you have an instinct that you're going to be good at something, or you should try something, absolutely believe in that, because that's your kind of true self, authentic self speaking. And you should always hang on to it and never give up till that appetite is kind of satisfied.
I mean, amazingly surmised. Yeah, truly very important, and that can apply to anyone. So thank you. The Last Wild is the first book in the series, and anyone can grab that now. The Wild Before is the new one coming out, so make sure to pick that up too. And thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great.
Cool. Have a great day.